History feels distant, but what really shocks people isn't how old things were. It's how normal some disturbing things once felt, things nobody questioned, things nobody stopped, things everyone accepted. And today, they feel completely unthinkable. Imagine a world where what you consider fundamentally wrong is just Tuesday, not a dramatic event, not a moral crisis, just an ordinary part of the day. This isn't science fiction. It's human history, repeated over and over. Take something like the widespread use of child labor during the Industrial Revolution. For us, the image of a small child working in a dangerous factory is horrifying. But back then, for many, it was an economic necessity, a fact of life. Families depended on it. Businesses were built on it, and the system chugged along. It wasn't that people were inherently evil. It's that the entire structure of their society normalized it. The context made the unthinkable routine. Human beings adapt quickly. When something is repeated long enough, it stops feeling wrong. This is a psychological principle called normalization. Think about the Roman Colosseum. We see it as a majestic ruin, but its original purpose was state-sponsored mass entertainment centered on death. Thousands would gather to watch gladiators fight to the end. It wasn't a fringe activity for the bloodthirsty. It was a family outing, a social event sponsored by the emperor. The cheers of the crowd weren't the sounds of monsters. They were the sounds of ordinary people who had been conditioned to see extreme violence as sport. The scale, the public approval, the sheer repetition, it all worked to strip the horror away, leaving only spectacle. History is full of behaviors that were once everyday life, not controversial, not shocking, just normal. Consider the centuries when dueling was an accepted way for gentlemen to settle disputes over honor. Instead of a lawsuit or a difficult conversation, the solution was to try and kill each other at dawn. And this wasn't some back alley brawl. It was a highly ritualized practice with established rules and etiquette, often involving respected members of society. Doctors and officials would be present. It was an institution. The idea that a personal insult could legally and socially justify a lethal confrontation seems insane to us now. But for generations, it was simply how certain men handled their problems. The system supported it. The most disturbing part wasn't the behavior itself, it was the silence around it. People didn't question. Authorities didn't interfere. And society moved forward as if nothing was wrong. This silence is the fertile ground where harmful norms take root. Look at medical practices from not so long ago. Lobotomies were once considered a revolutionary treatment for mental illness, winning a Nobel Prize in 1949. Doctors performed tens of thousands of them, often with catastrophic results, turning vibrant people into passive shells. The medical establishment, for a time, hailed it as a breakthrough. Dissent was minimal. The authority of science and medicine created a consensus that suppressed doubt. Families, desperate for a cure, consented. It took decades of ruined lives for the practice to be universally condemned as a brutal and ineffective butchery. The real horror wasn't just the ice pick. It was the applause from the operating theater. Because when everyone agrees, no one stops to think. This is the power of social consensus. It can make us blind. We see this in the history of institutionalization. For much of the 20th century, people with intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions were locked away in asylums, often for life. These places were frequently underfunded, overcrowded, and abusive. But for the public, it was out of sight, out of mind. The practice was framed as a compassionate act, both for the individuals and for a society that didn't know how to integrate them. The vast majority of people simply accepted that this was the way things had to be. It took tireless work from advocates, journalists, and families to expose the horrific conditions and challenge the entire premise of locking people away. The consensus wasn't broken by a single event, but by a slow, painful chipping away at the silence. Eventually, values change. What once felt acceptable becomes uncomfortable, then unacceptable, then unthinkable. This isn't a magical process. It's often driven by a collision with reality. Consider the environmental destruction of the 20th century. For decades, dumping industrial waste into rivers or pumping unfiltered smoke into the air was just the cost of doing business, the smell of progress. Rivers caught on fire. Cities were choked with smog that made people sick. The consequences became visible, tangible, and deadly. Only when the damage became so undeniable that it threatened public health and the economy on a massive scale did the values shift. Regulations that were once seen as radical and anti-business are now standard. Not because humans suddenly became better, but because consequences became impossible to ignore. The fight for women's suffrage is another powerful example. For centuries, the idea that women shouldn't vote was deeply embedded in legal, social, and religious structures. It was considered the natural order. Arguments against it were based on women's supposed emotional instability or intellectual inferiority. The suffragettes who chained themselves to railings and went on hunger strikes weren't just asking for a right. They were attacking the very foundation of what society considered normal. They made the consequences of exclusion impossible to ignore. They created a crisis, forcing society to confront the hypocrisy of a democracy that excluded half its population. The change didn't happen because men in power had a sudden moral epiphany. It happened because the pressure became relentless. The uncomfortable truth? Every generation believes it has already fixed its mistakes. We look back at slavery, at the divine right of kings, at the burning of witches, and we pat ourselves on the back. We see ourselves as the enlightened ones, the ones who finally got it right. We've learned. But this is a form of arrogance. It assumes that moral progress is a finished project, that we are at the end of history. But history strongly disagrees. This belief in our own righteousness is perhaps the most dangerous normalization of all. Because it prevents us from looking critically at ourselves. It makes us complacent. Some things we accept today will probably shock people in the future. What will they be? It's impossible to know for sure, but we can speculate. Will they be horrified by our industrial farming of animals, keeping billions of sentient creatures in confined spaces for our consumption? Will they be appalled by our consumption-driven economy, which generates mountains of plastic waste that chokes the oceans? Will they look at our digital lives, our social media obsessions, and see a form of mass delusion or mental illness that we simply accepted as normal? Perhaps they'll question our approach to work, where we trade the best hours of our day, the best years of our lives, for a salary, often in jobs we don't even like. What seems practical and necessary to us might seem like a form of self-imposed servitude to them. History doesn't feel disturbing until enough time passes. When it's happening, it just feels like life. The daily routine, the cultural norms, the economic realities, they all conspire to make the present moment feel inevitable and correct. We are fish swimming in water, unaware of the medium that surrounds us. It's only with the distance of time that we can see the water for what it is, its currents, its temperature, its toxins. The future will have that distance on us. They will see our blind spots with perfect clarity. And when it does, we ask the same question every time. How did people think this was normal? That question is not an accusation. It's a reflection of a fundamental human mystery. It's a recognition that good people can participate in and uphold systems that are profoundly wrong. It's an admission that sanity and morality are not fixed points, but are constantly being negotiated by society. And maybe, just maybe, asking that question about the past is the only tool we have to start asking it about the present. What are we accepting right now? What silence are we a part of? What will future generations ask about us? Thanks for watching.